The rain came down over Detroit that October evening, like it had a grudge against the whole city, and Della Robinson had no idea that the stranded stranger she was about to stop and help on a flooded back road was the very man she was driving downtown to avoid. She would learn it soon enough. But that is getting ahead of the story, and a story like this one deserves to be told the right way, from the beginning. Della Robinson was 44 years old, and she was tired in the way that only a certain kind of woman ever gets tired, the kind who has been holding up a whole world with her own two hands for so long that she has forgotten what it feels like to set it down. She gripped the wheel of her late father's old Chevy pickup, the wipers slapping back and forth against a windshield they could barely keep clear, and she muttered a small prayer under her breath, the way her mother had taught her, all those years ago, whenever the road turned mean. For most of her life, Della had been the one who fixed things. She had grown up under the hood of a car, handing wrenches to her daddy, Earl Robinson, in the garage he had built with his own hands on the east side of the city back in 1971. Robinson's Garage. The sign still read, in the same proud red letters. Earl had taught her everything: how to listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, how to find the one small broken thing that was making the whole machine fail, how to bring a dead motor back to breathing life. "Anybody can throw a part away, Deli," he used to say, wiping his hands on a rag. "Takes a real mechanic to save one." Earl had passed the winter before, and he had left his daughter two things: the garage he loved and the mountain of debt that came with it. That was only the latest weight on Della's shoulders. 3 years before, she had lost her husband, Marcus, a good, gentle, laughing man, gone in a single terrible night when his heart simply stopped, leaving Della a widow at 41 with a 5-year-old girl and a hole in her life the exact shape of him. She had grieved him the way you grieve half of yourself. And then she had done what women like Della always do. She had dried her face and squared her shoulders and gone on, for the sake of the only light left in her whole worn-down world. That light was asleep at her sister's house that very evening. Nia Robinson, 8 years old now, with 2 neat braids and a gap where her front tooth used to be, and a mind that never, ever stopped asking questions. Nia was the reason Della got up before dawn. Nia was the reason Della kept the garage doors open, even when the numbers said she shouldn't. And Nia, or rather Della's fierce determination that her daughter would grow up watching a mother who never quit, was the reason Della was out on this miserable road at all, driving toward the single most dreaded evening of her recent life: a blind date. The whole ridiculous idea belonged to her younger sister, Renee, who had been after Della for the better part of a year. "You have been in mourning long enough, Della Robinson," Renee had scolded her over the phone that very afternoon, in the voice their mother used to use. "Marcus loved you. Marcus would not want you spending the rest of your life talking to carburetors and worrying yourself gray over a shop full of other people's broken-down cars. This man is different. His name is Julian. He's a businessman, successful, a widower like you, and Diane at the church swears up and down he's a gentleman. Just go, put on that blue dress, show up at Laurent's at 7, and do it for me, if you won't do it for yourself." Laurent's. The name alone made Della's stomach tighten. It was one of those glittering downtown restaurants where a plate of food cost more than she spent on groceries in a week. The kind of place with cloth napkins folded like swans, and a wine list thicker than a Bible. Della had $80 in her purse, and a credit card she prayed nobody would ever ask her to use. She already knew how the night would go. She would sit across from some polished, comfortable man who had never once in his life lain awake doing arithmetic in the dark, and sooner or later he would ask what she did for a living, and she would watch his face do that thing, that small, polite flinch, when she said she fixed cars. She had seen that flinch before. She was not eager to see it again. But she had promised Renee, and Della Robinson did not break her promises, so she had put on the blue dress and kissed her daughter goodnight and pointed the old truck toward downtown through the worst storm the city had seen all season, never dreaming that the evening she dreaded was about to become the evening that saved her life. 12 miles away, in a very different part of the city, a man named Julian Whitfield was dreading the very same evening, and for reasons that were, though he would never have guessed it, almost exactly the same. Julian was 51 years old, and by every measure the world uses to keep score, he had won. He was the chairman and chief executive of Whitfield Holdings, a company his own hands had grown from a single office into an empire that touched half the skyline of the city. Real estate, technology, and quiet ownership of things most people never thought to wonder who owned. That very afternoon, in a boardroom high above the streets, he had closed the deal of the year, acquiring the historic Prentice building right out from under a rival who had wanted it for a decade. He had watched that rival, a smooth, venomous man named Richard Carmichael, go pale with fury across the polished table, and he had felt, in the moment of victory, absolutely nothing at all. That was the trouble with Julian Whitfield. He had everything a man could buy, and nothing a man actually needs. 4 years before, he had lost his wife. Catherine had been the warm center of his whole life, the one person on earth who saw past the empire to the ordinary man underneath, who teased him and grounded him and reminded him what mattered. When the illness took her, slowly and cruelly over the course of a hard year, it took the best of Julian with it. He had thrown himself into the work, the way wounded men do. He had built the company higher and higher, until he sat entirely alone at the very top of it, surrounded by people who wanted things from him, and no one at all who simply wanted him. His assistant and oldest friend, a sharp and kind-hearted woman named Diane, had watched him hollow out for 4 years, and she had finally decided she'd had enough. "You are going on this date, Julian, and that is the end of it," Diane had told him, laying an embossed reservation card on his desk that morning, with the firmness of a woman who had earned the right to boss him around. "She is a real person, from a real life, with real troubles and real strength. A widow raising her little girl and running her late father's business through hard times. She does not know your net worth, she does not care about your company, and she will not spend the evening trying to sell you anything. Consider it doctor's orders. You have forgotten how to talk to a human being, and it is breaking my heart to watch." Julian had hated the idea. He hated the vulnerability of it. He hated the thought of sitting across from some stranger and pretending to be charming when he had forgotten how. But some part of him, some small, stubborn, half-buried part that still remembered what it was to be happy, had said yes. And then, in a rare act of rebellion against the guarded, chauffeured, security-detailed life he had come to feel imprisoned by, Julian had done something he had not done in years. He had waved off his driver. He had sent his security team home, and he had walked into his garage and pulled the cover off the one possession he truly loved, a pristine 1969 Jaguar E-Type, British racing green, a machine of such heartbreaking beauty that Catherine used to call it his mistress. He would drive himself to the date. Just this once, he would be an ordinary man in a beautiful car on a rainy night. It was, as it turned out, a spectacular mistake. Classic cars are like proud old souls, magnificent and temperamental, and entirely unwilling to be taken for granted. Julian was halfway to downtown, on a winding, tree-lined back road that cut between the neighborhoods, when the Jaguar gave a violent shudder beneath him. A dreadful knocking rose from under the long green hood, and then, with a final sputter, the engine simply died, and the beautiful car coasted to a silent, useless stop on the gravel shoulder, miles from anywhere, swallowed by the dark and the drumming rain. Julian tried the key. Nothing. He reached for his phone, and found no signal at all in the wooded dip where he'd stalled. He sat there in his fine suit, in his priceless car, the most powerful man for miles in any direction, and he was, for all his money could do about it, completely and utterly stranded. He did not know it yet, but help was already on its way. Help in an old Chevy pickup. Help he was about to dread meeting even more than the car trouble itself. The pileup on the main road was what did it. Della came over the rise to find the highway a frozen river of red taillights, going nowhere, and after 10 minutes of not moving an inch, she made the same decision Julian had made an hour before. She took the next exit and cut for the back roads, the winding, tree-canopied streets she'd known since she was a girl riding shotgun in her daddy's truck. It was the long way, and a rougher way in this weather, but it was her only chance of reaching Laurence before 7. Her headlights swept the dark, the rain coming down in silver sheets, and that was when she saw it. The chrome caught her beams first, a long, low, elegant silhouette sitting all wrong on the narrow shoulder, tilted into the mud. Della slowed the truck, and her breath caught. because she knew that shape the way some people know a face, a Jaguar E-Type, a real one. She'd seen exactly two in her whole life, both of them in magazines her father had kept stacked in the corner of the shop like scripture. And it was sitting out here in the storm, dying in the mud, which struck Della, deep down in the part of her that Earl Robinson had built, as something close to a sin. Now, Della Robinson had every reason in the world to drive on past. She was already running late. She was in her good blue dress. She was a woman alone on a dark and lonely road, and every ounce of caution she owned told her that stopping for strangers in the middle of nowhere was how good women ended up in bad situations. She slowed. She almost went on. But she couldn't. Leaving a person stranded out here, in this weather, on this road. Her conscience simply would not allow it, no matter what it cost her. That was how Earl had raised her, and how Marcus had loved her, and how she was raising Nia in turn. When you can help, you help. It was that simple, and that hard. She pulled the old truck over ahead of the Jaguar, crunching onto the gravel, and flipped on her hazard lights. Inside the stalled car, Julian jumped as the harsh amber light suddenly filled his mirrors. His heart hammered. A lifetime of caution, and a fair number of security briefings, had taught him to see every unexpected figure in the dark as a possible threat. He watched, tense, as a tall figure stepped down from the pickup, pulled a jacket up against the rain, and came walking toward him. It was not, he realized as the figure drew close, at all what he had braced for. It was a woman. She moved with a calm, unhurried competence, entirely unbothered by the storm, and when she reached his window and leaned down, he saw a strong, handsome face, streaming with rain, with eyes that were tired but kind, and altogether unafraid. Della tapped on the glass. "You all right in there?" she called over the wind. Julian hesitated only a moment, then lowered the window a few inches. The clean smell of rain and wet earth filled the leather cabin. "I'm fine," he said, out of pure reflex, the automatic armor of a man who never admitted weakness. "Thank you. I've called for a service. They're on their way." Della raised one eyebrow. She looked, pointedly, at the dead dashboard. No glowing lights, no radio, nothing. Then she looked back at him. "Sir," she said, with a patience that was almost gentle, "unless you called that service on a phone that gets a signal out here, which no phone on God's earth does, nobody knows where you are, and nobody's coming. The main road's shut down for miles behind me." She tilted her head toward the long green hood. "Now you want to pop that hood and let me have a look, or you want to sit out here in your nice suit and wait for morning?" Julian blinked. He was a man before whom entire boardrooms fell silent. He was not remotely accustomed to being talked to like this, plainly, firmly, with no fear and no fuss, and to his own great surprise, he found he rather liked it. "You know something about cars?" he asked. Something flickered across the woman's face, half a smile, quickly hidden. "You could say that. That's a 1969 E-Type Series 2 you're sitting in, and if I had to guess, I'd say your trouble's electrical, on account of every one of these beautiful British machines has a nervous breakdown the minute it gets rained on." She wiped water from her eyes. "Pop the hood, please." Astonished, for she had named the exact year and series of his car in the dark, in the rain, in a glance, Julian reached down and pulled the latch. Della lifted the long clamshell hood, propped it, and clicked on the small waterproof flashlight she kept clipped inside her jacket, the way her father had taught her never to be without one. She bent over the engine bay, and her hands moved through it with the sure, practiced, unhurried grace of a surgeon who has done 10,000 operations. Julian, watching through the rain-streaked windshield, found he could not look away. After a moment, he couldn't stand to sit there useless while a stranger did the work in the pouring rain. He pushed open the heavy door, stepped out into the storm and, spotting the golf umbrella on the seat, opened it and came around to hold it over her and the exposed engine, shielding them both from the worst of it. Della glanced up, surprised. Most men she'd met with cars like this would have stayed dry inside. "You didn't have to come out in this," she said. "I don't much care to be a bystander to my own troubles," Julian answered. That earned him a real look, a second, longer look, this one appraising. "Now that," Della said, "is the smartest thing anybody's said to me all week." She turned her flashlight to a small cylindrical part near the front of the engine. There's your gremlin. Distributor cap. Moisture's gotten up under the casing, and it's shorting out your spark. That's why she died on you. Real common on these old cars. Nothing broken. She's just cold and wet and scared is all. She pulled a clean rag from her pocket and began carefully, tenderly, drying the delicate parts, talking to the engine low under her breath, the way Earl always had. "Can you actually fix it?" Julian asked. "Out here? Enough to get you back to the land of the living." She wiped her hands and gave him a small, wry smile. "It's your lucky night, mister. Of all the cars to break down in front of, you broke down in front of somebody who actually loves this one." "Lucky," Julian repeated, and let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's not the word I'd have chosen for tonight. I'm on my way to a dinner I've been dreading for a week." Della gave a short, surprised laugh of her own and kept working. "Join the club. I'm on my way to the worst evening of my recent life myself. A blind date." She shook her head. "My sister set it up. Some rich businessman. I already know exactly how it's going to go. I'll sit there in this dress and he'll ask me what I do. And the second I say I fix cars for a living, I'll get that look. You know the one. Polite. Disappointed." She reattached the dried cap, snugging the screws. Men like that don't know what to do with a woman who's got dirt under her nails. Julian went very still under the umbrella, though Della, bent over the engine, did not notice. For he was thinking of the woman Diane had described to him that morning. A widow, raising her little girl, running her late father's business through hard times. And he was looking at a woman in a good blue dress, out on a dark road in a storm, with rain in her hair, and grace in her hands and dirt. Yes, under her nails, and something in his chest, something that had been asleep for 4 long years, turned over and woke. "Maybe," he said quietly, "your businessman is dreading it just as much as you are. Maybe he's tired of everybody wanting something from him. Maybe he'd give anything to sit across from somebody who's exactly what she looks like, and not one bit more." Della paused, just for a second, and looked up at him through the rain. "Maybe," she allowed. Then she stepped back and closed the hood. "Well, let's find out if she'll start. Go on, get in and turn her over." Julian slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, sputtered, and then roared to smooth, throaty, glorious life. Relief swept over his face, and Della felt a warm flush of the old pride, Earl's pride, the pride of bringing something back from the dead. She stepped to the window. "There she is. Now you take those corners slow going back, you hear? Roads are slick as glass tonight." Julian looked up at her, and for reasons he could not have explained, he did not want the moment to end. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You're soaked to the bone, and you stopped for a stranger, and you asked for nothing." He hesitated. "May I at least know your name?" She smiled, a real smile, the first easy one she'd worn in longer than she could remember. "Della," she said. "Folks call me Della." "Julian," he said, and reached his hand out the window into the rain, and she shook it, her strong, calloused hand in his. "Thank you, Della. Truly. Good luck with your dreaded date." "Good luck with yours," she laughed, backing toward her truck. "Whoever the poor woman is, tell her I said to run." And they parted, the old Chevy pickup and the gleaming green Jaguar pulling away in opposite directions into the storm, neither one of them knowing that the honest, easy, unguarded few minutes they'd just shared on the shoulder of a lonely road had been with the exact person each of them was so desperately dreading to meet. Laurent's was a different world. Heavy velvet drapes swallowed the sound of the storm outside, replacing it with the soft murmur of a string quartet and the delicate chime of crystal. Chandeliers threw a warm gold light over tables dressed in white linen, where the comfortable people of the city dined on small, expensive things arranged like art. Della felt the weight of the room the moment she stepped through the door, still damp from the rain, her blue dress hopelessly plain against the silk and jewels around her. She lifted her chin. Earl Robinson had raised his daughter to walk into any room in this world like she had every right to be there, and she was not about to shame him now. A sharply dressed maitre d' with a thin, cool smile looked her over. The damp hem of her dress, the practical shoes, the hands she couldn't quite scrub all the grease from no matter how she tried. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. "Whitfield," Della said, remembering the name Renee had given her. "Party of 2. The change in the man was almost comical. "Ah, Mr. Whitfield's guest, of course. Right this way." And he led her, suddenly all deference, through the maze of tables toward a quiet, curved booth by the tall windows overlooking the river. Della followed, her stomach in knots, already rehearsing her polite exit. One drink, a little conversation. She'd blame an early morning at the shop and be home before 10. She had almost talked herself calm, and then the man in the booth turned his head to look at her, and Della Robinson stopped dead in the middle of the floor. It was him. It was the man from the rain, the man in the beautiful green car, the man whose engine she had brought back to life not 40 minutes before, still in the very same suit, now dry, staring up at her with an expression of pure, thunderstruck disbelief. "Della," Julian breathed. "Julian," she said faintly, gripping the back of an empty chair to steady herself. The maitre d' looked between them, baffled. "I see you are already acquainted. I'll send your server directly." And he bowed and hurried off, glad to be gone. Della sank slowly into the booth across from him. For a long moment, the two of them just stared at each other, the impossibility of it hanging in the air between them, like the last note of a song. And then Julian's face broke. First a twitch at the corner of his mouth, then a full, helpless, delighted smile, and Della felt the laughter rising up in her own chest, unstoppable, until it spilled out of her, warm and real and free, the first true laugh she'd laughed in years. "You," she managed, shaking her head, "you are the rich businessman my sister has been trying to sell me on for a year. And you," Julian said, grinning like a boy, "are the poor woman you told me to warn to run." He spread his hands. "Della, my date was you. It was always you. Of all the stranded cars on all the back roads in Detroit. Lord have mercy." Della pressed a hand to her mouth. "I told you to take the corners slow. I fixed your date's car and told her to run." "You did," he said, and they both dissolved again, laughing until Della had to wipe her eyes. And just like that, the dread was gone. The armor both of them had strapped on for this dreaded evening simply fell away, because there was no point to it anymore. They had already met, out in the honest dark, with no restaurant and no reputations, and nothing to hide behind. They had already seen each other plain. When at last they caught their breath, Julian folded his hands on the linen and looked at her with new, curious eyes. "So, Della, Diane told me you run your father's shop. She didn't mention you could rebuild a British sports car in a thunderstorm in a cocktail dress." "Robinson's Garage, East Side. My daddy built it in '71. Pride and grief moved together across her face. "He passed last winter. Left it to me. The shop and everything that comes with it." She turned her water glass slowly. "And I didn't rebuild anything. I dried off a distributor cap. Any fool who grew up the way I grew up could have done the same." "I don't believe that for a moment," Julian said quietly. "And what does a man do?" she asked, turning it back on him. "That lets him drive a car worth more than my whole shop and not know how to keep it running?" Julian hesitated. On the rare dinners he endured, he had learned to hide the size of his world, tired of watching people change the instant they knew it. But looking at Della Robinson, a woman who had stood in the freezing rain and fixed his car and asked him for nothing, a woman who plainly could not have cared less about his money, he felt an unfamiliar pull toward the plain truth. "My name is Julian Whitfield," he said. "I run a company called Whitfield Holdings." Della's eyebrows rose. You could not live in Detroit and not know that name. It was on buildings, on developments, in the papers. She let out a low breath. "Well, that surely explains the way that man at the door turned inside out when I said your name." She studied him, and there was no greed in her look, no calculation, only a plain, level curiosity. "Does it bother you? People finding out?" "Every time," Julian admitted. "Usually I watch their faces change. Yours didn't." "I've got bigger worries than the size of your bank account, Mr. Whitfield," Della said dryly, and he laughed again. Their server arrived then, presenting 2 leather-bound menus as thick as hymnals. Della opened hers, and her stomach dropped. A single dinner cost more than she spent to feed herself and Nia for a week. $40 for a plate of vegetables. She had $80 in her purse and her pride, and she was calculating, fast and cold, how to order the smallest thing on the page without letting it show on her face. But Julian Whitfield had not built an empire without learning to read a person. He saw the almost invisible tightening around her eyes, and he understood at once. And he understood, too, that this was a proud woman who would sooner walk out hungry than be pitied. So he did the only gracious thing there was to do. He closed his own menu. "You know what, Della?" he said, easy and light, as if the thought had just struck him. "I cannot stand this place. The food's fussy. The portions are a joke, and half the people in this room spent the afternoon trying to ruin the other half. I only agreed to meet here because it was neutral ground." He looked at her. "I'd a whole lot rather go find some real food. Would you let me?" Della looked at him for a long moment, at the kindness in it, and the care, and the way he had handed her the choice so she never had to feel the weight of the menu at all, and something in her chest, some long clenched thing, eased. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I know exactly the place." They were almost to the door when a shadow fell across their path. "Julian Whitfield, as I live and breathe." The voice was smooth as oil and just as cold. "And here I thought this establishment had standards." Julian turned, and his easy manner cooled by 10 degrees. Standing before them, immaculate in a custom suit, silver hair perfectly in place, was Richard Carmichael, the rival Julian had beaten that very afternoon for the Prentice building. 2 well-dressed associates hovered behind him, smirking. Richard's eyes slid from Julian to Della, and traveled over her damp blue dress with a slow, theatrical contempt that made Della's spine go straight as a rod. "And who is this?" Richard drawled. "Surely not a new acquisition, Julian. She looks a touch pre-owned. Don't tell me Whitfield Holdings has opened a charity wing for the city's working poor." Julian's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth. But Della laid 2 fingers lightly on his sleeve. "It's all right, Julian," she said, calm as still water. She turned to face Richard fully, and she did not shrink 1 inch. She looked him up and down the same way he had looked at her, slow and unbothered, the way she'd size up a car somebody was trying to sell her for too much. And her eyes came to rest on the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist. "That's a fine watch," Della said pleasantly. "Rolex Daytona. Beautiful piece of machinery." She tilted her head, listening almost, the way she listened to an engine. "Though if I were you, I'd get that mainspring serviced. You see how the second hand's dragging, hitching about a quarter beat behind where it ought to be? That's the internal lubrication all dried up inside. Happens when a body buys an expensive machine just to show it off, instead of taking the trouble to actually care for it." She smiled, warm and devastating. "A machine always tells on its owner, sooner or later. Doesn't matter how much it cost." Richard's smug smile curdled. His hand moved, instinctively, to cover the watch. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm just saying," Della went on, her voice gentle and even, and utterly merciless. "You can put a $10,000 shine on a rusted-out frame, mister. But anybody who actually knows what they're looking at can still hear the engine knocking." She patted his arm, once, kindly. "You have yourself a good evening now." Behind Richard, one of his associates made a strangled sound and stared very hard at the floor. Richard Carmichael, who had spent his whole life among people who fought by the rules of his own gilded world, and who had no earthly idea what to do with a woman who did not, went a deep and furious red, turned on his heel, and stalked off without another word. Julian stared at Della, something like awe on his face. In 20 years he had watched titans of industry try and fail to rattle Richard Carmichael. He had never once seen anyone take the man apart so completely, or so calmly, or with so little effort. "Della Robinson," he said slowly, "you are a dangerous woman. I deal with overpriced, overinflated, stubborn machines every day of my life," Della said, taking his arm and steering him toward the door, and the honest rain beyond it. "That one wasn't even a hard case. Come on, let's go get you some real food." The rain had softened to a fine mist by the time Julian's Jaguar and Della's pickup pulled into the cracked lot of Pearl's Kitchen, a low brick diner on a corner of the east side that had been feeding the neighborhood for 40 years. A buzzing neon sign glowed in the window. Inside, the light was bright and plain. The booths were red vinyl worn soft by decades, and the air was thick and wonderful, with the smell of frying onions, seasoned meat, hot cornbread, and strong coffee. It was, in every possible way, the opposite of Laurence. Julian stepped out of his beautiful car in his fine suit and stood for a moment breathing it in, and something in his shoulders came down that had been up for 4 years. A bell jingled as they walked in, and a broad, gray-haired woman behind the counter looked up from the griddle. "Della Robinson, where you been hiding, baby?" Then her eyes went to Julian, and up, and back to Della, with a look that promised a great many questions later. "Evening, Miss Pearl," Della said, guiding Julian to a corner booth. "2 of the specials. And extra cornbread." Miss Pearl brought them 2 plates heaped high, smothered chicken, greens, mac and cheese, cornbread still steaming, food that cost less than the tip Julian would have left at Laurence, and was worth 100 times more. Julian looked at it and looked at Della, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the frantic, hungry, hollow thing inside him go quiet. Della watched the CEO of Whitfield Holdings pick up his fork and take a bite, and watched his eyes close. "Della," he said when he could speak, "this is the best thing I have eaten in 10 years. "I know," she said simply, and smiled. And there, under the bright plain lights of Pearl's kitchen, with gospel playing low on the radio, and Miss Pearl humming at the griddle, the 2 of them talked, really talked, in a way neither had done with another living soul in years. Stripped of the restaurant and the rain, and the roles they'd been dreading to play, they simply told each other the truth. Della told him about Marcus, her husband, gone 3 years now, the laughing gentle man whose heart had failed him in the night. She told him about the hollow, roaring silence of the house after. She told him about Nia, 8 years old and full of questions, building Lego rocket ships and painting pictures that covered the refrigerator, the one bright reason Della got up in the dark every morning. And she told him, because he asked, gently, and because she found she could, about the shop, about Earl and the legacy and the debt, about the letter from the bank folded in her purse that very moment, the one that said she had 2 weeks to find $40,000 or lose Robinson's garage forever. "So why fight for it?" Julian asked, not unkindly. "A shop that's bleeding you dry. You could take a job at a dealership tomorrow and never lose sleep again. Why hold on?" Della was quiet a moment, turning her coffee cup. "Because my daddy built it," she said finally, "with his own 2 hands, at a time and in a place where a man like him wasn't supposed to be able to build anything at all. Every brick in that building is him telling the whole world he was here, and he mattered, and he made something." She looked up. "And because I want my Nia to grow up watching her mama fight for something worth fighting for. When something's broke, Julian, you don't just throw it out. You take the time to understand it, and you find the one thing that's wrong, and you put in the work to bring it back. My daddy taught me there's a soul in these old machines." Her voice went soft. "I believe there's a soul in most things worth keeping. You just have to be willing to do the work." Julian looked at her across the chipped table for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that Della couldn't quite read. "I lost my wife too," he said quietly. 4 years ago. Catherine. She was the only person who ever saw the man, and not the money." He turned his own cup slowly. "I've spent 4 years building the company higher and higher, telling myself the work would fill the hole. It doesn't. You just end up alone at the top of a very tall building, and every single person who comes to see you wants something." He gave a small, tired smile. "You're the first person in 4 years who didn't. You stopped your truck in a storm to help a stranger, and you never once asked me for a thing." "I didn't know who you were," Della pointed out gently. "That," said Julian, "is exactly my point." They sat in Pearl's kitchen until Miss Pearl started stacking chairs, drinking bad coffee, and trading childhoods and small failures, and the quiet dreams a person doesn't say out loud to just anybody. And for a few golden hours, Della Robinson did not feel the weight of the bank's letter, and Julian Whitfield did not feel the crushing loneliness of his empire. They were only 2 tired people who had lost the loves of their lives, and who had somehow, on the worst night either of them had dreaded, found an unexpected place to set the weight down. When Julian finally walked her to her truck under a clearing sky, the first stars just breaking through, Della felt lighter than she had in years. "Thank you, Julian," she said, "for dinner, for being a good sport about the whole ridiculous thing." "Thank you, Della," he said, "for stopping." He hesitated, then added, "If that beautiful car of mine acts up again, you'll know where I'll be bringing it." "I do," she said, and smiled up at him. "Robinson's Garage, East Side. You can't miss the sign." 3 days later, the world came crashing back down. Della stood in the quiet bay of Robinson's Garage, the morning light slanting through the tall, dusty windows, and read the final notice of foreclosure for the third time, as if reading it again might change the numbers. It did not. 2 weeks, $40,000, or the bank would take the shop her father built, the last standing proof that Earl Robinson had walked this earth, and there was not one thing in her power she could do about it. Her hands, streaked with the morning's work, trembled just slightly as she folded the letter away. Across the shop, Nia sat on a high stool by the workbench, humming to herself, snapping together a Lego rocket ship, blessedly unaware that the ground was about to open beneath them. Della looked at her daughter, the gap-toothed smile, the careful, serious little hands, and she pressed down the wave of panic rising in her throat, the way she had pressed down every wave for 3 years. She would find a way. She always found a way. She just didn't know, this time, what the way could possibly be. She had not heard from Julian. She told herself that was for the best. She had spent 3 days telling herself that. What had she expected? That a billionaire would fix her whole broken life because they'd shared a plate of smothered chicken. Fairy tales did not happen to widows with grease under their nails and foreclosure notices in their purses. He was back in his glass tower, and she was down here in the real world, doing the same arithmetic in the dark she had always done. She had enjoyed one good evening. That would have to be enough. It was more than she'd had in years. She picked up a wrench and turned back to the car on the lift, blinking hard, and told herself, firmly, to be grateful for the memory and let the rest go. And that was when she heard it. Low and throaty and unmistakable, the deep purr of an engine she had personally brought back to life on a rainy road 3 nights before, rolling into the gravel lot of Robinson's Garage. Della turned around slowly, the wrench forgotten in her hand. The engine cut off. The long door of the green Jaguar swung open, and Julian Whitfield stepped out into the morning sun, but not the Julian of the boardroom or the restaurant. This Julian wore plain jeans and a simple shirt, and an old leather jacket, and he looked, standing there in the gritty lot of the East Side Garage, more at ease than Della had ever seen him. He walked into the shop, and his eyes found Nia first. He crossed to her and crouched down to her level, careful and kind. "Now that," he said, nodding at the Lego ship, "is a serious piece of engineering. Are those the new thrusters?" Nia beamed and held it up. "Yeah! My mama says if you don't build the engine right, the whole ship falls apart." "Your mama," said Julian, standing and turning his gaze to Della, "is the smartest person I know." Della set down the wrench, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "Julian, what are you doing here?" He reached into the leather bag over his shoulder and drew out a thick folder, and he laid it on the workbench, right beside the bank's foreclosure notice, which he glanced at and understood, and let his face show nothing but respect. "I have a problem, Della," he said, and there was a playful, careful formality in his voice now. "Whitfield Holdings runs a fleet of more than 50 vehicles, executive cars, service trucks, the whole operation. On top of that, I've got a personal collection of 11 vintage cars that a very expensive dealership has been mishandling for years. A dealership, I might add, that couldn't tell a distributor cap from a coffee cup." He tapped the folder. "For 2 years I've been paying too much for too little. I need somebody who actually knows what they're doing." Della stared at the folder, her breath gone shallow. "What is this?" "That," Julian said, "is a 3-year exclusive contract. Fleet maintenance and vintage restoration for all of Whitfield Holdings, and for my personal collection. It comes with a signing retainer paid up front." He paused. "A retainer more than large enough to make a certain banking problem disappear this week." and keep this shop's doors open for a good long time." For a long moment Della couldn't speak, and then her chin came up, and her father's pride rose in her, fierce and unbending. "Julian," she said quietly, "I thank you, but I don't take charity. I never have, and I'm not about to start." "And I am not offering any," Julian said, and he stepped closer, and his voice was entirely serious now. "Della, I am a businessman. I do not make bad deals, and I did not build what I built by being sentimental with a contract. I stood in a thunderstorm and watched you diagnose an engine by the sound of it. I watched you save a car. 3 other shops told me was hopeless. In a cocktail dress, in the rain, asking for nothing. You are the finest mechanic I have ever seen in my life, and I would be a fool to let the best in the city keep struggling, while I overpay a dealership that doesn't care." He held her eyes. "This is not me rescuing you, Della. This is me being smart enough to hire you. There's a difference, and you of all people know it." Della looked at the contract. She looked at her daughter, humming over her rocket ship. She looked at the folded foreclosure notice, and at the man standing before her in his old jacket with his heart plain on his face, and she understood, at last, that he had found the one way to help her that let her keep every ounce of her pride intact. He had not offered her a handout. He had offered her a fair day's pay for the finest work she knew how to do. He had seen her, exactly as she was, and found her worthy. "Well," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "when you put it like that, Mr. Whitfield, it would be bad business of me to say no." Julian smiled, a slow, warm, unguarded smile, and then, quieter, he added the truth beneath the truth. "Besides," he said, "I needed a reason to see you again, and I had a feeling you'd never let me buy you dinner twice." Della laughed, and the last of the weight she'd been carrying for 3 long years lifted clean off her shoulders and drifted up into the dusty golden light. "You'd have figured it out," she said. "You seem like a man who fixes things too." "I'm learning," Julian said, stepping closer. "I had a good teacher. She told me when something's broken, you don't throw it away. You take the time to understand it, and you find the one thing that's wrong, and you put in the work to bring it back." He looked around the humble shop, at the tools and the half-built engines and the little girl playing among them, and back at the woman before him. "I've been throwing things away for 4 years, Della. I'd like to try the other way now, if you'll have me." And Della Robinson, widow, mother, mechanic, keeper of her father's legacy, the woman who had stopped her truck in a storm to help a stranger and asked for nothing at all, looked up at him and knew, the way she knew the sound of a healthy engine, that some things in this life are worth the work. "Miss Pearl's still open," she said softly, "and she makes a truly terrible cup of coffee." "That," said Julian, "sounds perfect." They did not throw their arms around each other. They were not young, and they had both loved and lost, and they knew that the best things are built slowly, piece by careful piece. But Della reached out and took his hand, his soft hand in her strong, calloused one, and the two of them stood there a long moment in the sunlit garage, 2 lonely people who had found each other on the worst night they dreaded, while an 8-year-old girl hummed and built a rocket ship out of the pieces on the floor. And if you had asked Della Robinson, later, what she had learned on that stormy October night, she would have wiped her hands on a rag and told you this, that the most beautiful things in life are almost never the ones that come to us shining and perfect and whole. They are the ones we find stranded in the dark, the ones everybody else has given up on, the ones we take the time to understand and to love and to bring back to breathing life, one patient, faithful, hard-won piece at a time. That is what her daddy taught her, in a garage on the East Side, a long time ago. And that, in the end, is what she taught the loneliest rich man in the city, on the night she stopped her truck in the rain, for a stranger, and asked for nothing at all.